Good afternoon. This is wildlife biologist Eric Orff with my New Hampshire Fish and Wildlife YouTube channel. Well, guess what? I'm holding another moose antler. You know, I really enjoyed working with moose during my 31 career at New Hampshire Fish and Game. I handled over 40 moose during that career, so I've kind of had my hand on the pulse of New Hampshire's moose for a long time. Back in the 80s, when they were first coming into the state, I could kind of track moose as they came into the state. You could, or the central part of the state, by where I would have moose, hear of moose sightings. But the last 20 years, there's been a significant impact of climate change on our moose. So today I want to talk about how climate change is impacting New Hampshire's moose. Actually, it's impacting it several ways. The worst, by far, is winter ticks. When I was tagging bears back in the mid-80s, I would pick up road-killed moose and use them to attract bears to a site for capture and radio collaring. And some of the moose I picked up were just covered in thousands and thousands of raisin-sized ticks. So it just was a sight to be seen. Well, in fact, the ticks have gotten far worse than they were in the 80s. And in fact, on an annual basis, the winter ticks in New Hampshire kill about 27% of the moose every year, a 27% mortality rate. Whereas hunting, and the moose season just started 3 days ago, on Saturday, October 19th, hunters take less than 1% of our moose, and with only 49 permits being issued this year. So very few moose, and automobiles kill about 5%, about 110 or 20 moose a year. So what is causing the winter ticks to kill our moose? It is the length of the winter. When people say, "Oh, it was minus 40 degrees in Pittsburgh last night, it's got to have killed the ticks." And look how much snow they have now in January and February. It's probably killing the ticks. Heck no. In November is when baby ticks quest or get on moose. So, and by actual count, over 100,000 on some of these moose. So it's whether there's snow on the ground in November, whether there are a lot of ticks on the moose, and therefore their impact. Because you know what? The ticks basically are on a moose all along at 100 degrees. It's like going to the Caribbean for them. They're at a constant 100 degrees, night and day. They don't care how much snow there is, how cold it is, because they're at 100 degrees. They have an animal they can feed on as much as they need, and the ticks do. They transform themselves, I think, 3 times over the winter, and they begin debilitating the moose. Moose, I've seen where they rub up against trees, and they remove big parts of their fur. But the most important factor is the impact on moose calves, the calves that were born the previous spring. Mortality rates have been as high as 75% in recent studies here in New Hampshire and Maine and even Vermont, where each January for several years, Fish and Game hired a crew to put radio collars on a couple dozen moose, on the calves in particular, and most winters the mortality rate of those calves was 60 to 75%. So our moose calves are dying in great numbers, which they didn't do 25 years ago in the first moose study in the 90s. So moose calves are dying. They would actually have to resupply their blood supply every 2 weeks or so in order to survive. They simply cannot do that. So moose calves are dying of anemia, and it just wears them down until they die of pneumonia or whatever other causes that might be. They just cannot survive this many ticks. Now, the other factor is how long the winter is. If there's no snow on the ground in April, when the females engorge on blood once more and drop off, if they drop off on snow, then a lot of those will freeze, and the eggs will not survive to hatching. If they drop off on bare ground, then you have a lot of baby ticks. Now, baby ticks actually quest by forming like a ball. So when one hooks onto a moose, they all get on by the thousands. Unlike, you get a dog tick or a deer tick on you, it's one. But for moose, they get on by the thousands, therefore they kill them. So even in the wintertime, yes, it does kill many of the calves, but also impacts the adult moose because they are worn down. And what Fish and Game, through their studies, have found the last 20 years is the females are underweight. They're malnourished. Many of the females no longer even become pregnant during the fall breeding season, which is right now. And when this study was first done in the 1990s, most older cow moose are older than age 3 produce twins every year, 2 calves. No longer. None of our cow moose are producing calves because they are just too stressed from ticks. And the other thing is climate change has warmed our summers. In June, when the moose calves are born, the last several years we've had 80-degree days in June. And when it's above like 72 degrees, moose cease to feed. They go into the shade, they go into the water, they cease feeding. So when it gets too warm, the moose don't feed and they can't put on weight, they can't maintain these calves, and therefore fewer calves are being born, fewer calves survive. So a double whammy: calves are being killed by winter ticks because of climate change, and the adult females are impacted by winter ticks and by the heat, the warmer summers and warmer conditions where they don't feed as much. So our moose numbers in the last 20 years, the last 15 years, since about 2000, the last 19 years, when it peaked out at around 7,500 plus moose, to about 3,000 or 3,300 moose now, according to recently retired moose biologist Chris Rhines, who I try to talk to fairly frequently still. So our moose numbers are down 60% from what they were 15 or 20 years ago. The other factor is it impacting our moose hunting. So the season is now ongoing. This year only 49 permits were issued, a 97% reduction in moose hunting permits since 675 were issued in just 2005. So just over a decade ago, almost 700 moose hunting permits were issued, and now it's 49. And that's impacting the North Country, the businesses that counted on moose hunters, the restaurants, the lodging. So it impacts the whole economic base of much of New Hampshire, especially the North Country, where moose hunting is so significant for their economy. Moose viewing, a $12 million a year industry, may very well be impacted by our reduction in moose numbers. In fact, a couple of years ago, during the ongoing moose study by UNH, where they had a couple dozen moose radio called, I saw a projection of where the moose population might be over the next 10 or 20 years. And you know what? That population was down to just a few hundred. So yes, we will still have some moose, but for all intents and purposes, moose will be gone. In fact, I think Chris Ryan, the moose biologist, kind of referenced that here. She was saying, moose are facing a triple threat in our changing climate: increasing temperatures, changing forest species, and increased mortality due to parasites may make it very hard to maintain a viable moose population in New Hampshire in the future. So our recently retired moose biologist Chris Rhines really looks at the devastating effect that climate change has had on our moose. So we all need to act on whatever we can do to reduce the impacts of climate change here in New Hampshire.